How's it going, everyone? This is Boots with Snapkeep Arcade, back with another standard deck guide with Spencer Howland of Constructed Criticism. This week we'll be talking about green white midrange, a super fun deck that's aggressive and has a strong late game, and wins with some of the coolest combinations in standard, specifically putting an On Serra's wings on a Carnage Tyrant. Thanks for joining us again, Spencer. Why don't you start by letting us know the overall strategy of the deck?
Yeah, this deck is, it might be a little bit different than what you guys are used to seeing. And we've been doing deck techs on some of the best decks in standard and mono blue. But, you know, I think that there is always room in every given metagame to innovate. And if you listen to Constructive Criticism, you know that my co-host and Hall of Famer Seth Manfield played a green-white deck at the Pro Tour. He played green-white because he thought it was good against green-black and that he could tune it to beat other things. If you look at the GP right before the Pro Tour, there was a 10th place green-white list that was a mid-range deck that played On Serra's Wings. And it was an On Serra's Wings, Vine Mare, and Carnage Tyrant deck. I adapted some of that technology, took a little bit from that, took a little bit from what Seth was doing, and I kind of jammed the two together and then tuned it. So I've played quite a few matches with this deck, and the point of this deck is that you're kind of a rampy mid-range deck. So you're playing 6 mana creatures in the form of 4 Llanowar Elves and 2 Druid of the Cowl. This is so that you can play your Planeswalkers faster than your opponents, whether it's your Vivien Reids or your Karns. People should be playing Karn, by the way, in green-black now if they're not, or some of your big threats, like something like Carnage Tyrant or Lyra. You also have some nutty draws. You can go turn 1 Llanowar Elves into turn 2 History of Benalia, and then if you follow that up with another History of Benalia or a Knight of Autumn, you just have a giant army very quickly on the battlefield that your opponent has to deal with. The deck has a few interactive cards, you know, things like 3 Ixalan's Binding is its main way to interact, you know, just getting rid of something and make it so your opponent can't cast it. It's got a couple of Baffling Ends in the main deck, and then it has 1 Assure Assembly. Assure Assembly is the newest addition to the deck. This is a card that I think is kind of a really fun one-of for the deck. Being able to just play a one-of card that has a pretty big impact on both sides when it's cast, but isn't that great and isn't an amazing card. So you might have seen a lot of team or energy lists back in the day that played something like 1 Blossoming Defense, and this is acting in a similar manner. People are going to have to spend quite a bit of mana to try and deal with your board or deal with a creature because the answers in this format are just expensive, and if you can answer their answer while making your creature indestructible and putting a 1/1 counter on it, say they try and cast a Wrath effect against your Carnage Tyrant for 5 mana, and then you just Assure Assembly it, you know, assure it to keep it alive, and then you can also end step make a bunch of knights with something like a History in play, and really at the end of the turn surprise them with an extra 12 damage coming at their face. So the overall strategy of the deck is just a fast mid-range deck. That's why you have Adanto Vanguard. Adanto Vanguard is another piece that, along with Carnage Tyrant in the main deck, really fits well with On Serra's Wings. You put On Serra's Wings on a Adanto Vanguard, and you just have a 4-power indestructible flying creature that gains you 4 life every turn. And obviously, if you put it on a Carnage Tyrant, it's just insane. So that's kind of the overall arcing strategy, right? You just this fast mid-range deck with a little bit of interaction, and you can kind of cheese them out with Assure Assembly or On Serra's Wings.
Let's go over the creatures in the deck.
The mana creatures we've dived into a little bit, but I think they're really key to the deck. Being able to play a turn 3 Karn or a turn 2 History of Benalia, it's just going to put you really far ahead against the other mid-range decks. Now, while Llanowar Elves isn't the best against something like the red aggro decks, a turn 2 History of Benalia actually is quite good against those decks. So if they don't shock your Llanowar Elves right away, that's pretty big. And the fact that, you know, they have to take their entire turn off early to do something like a shock on Llanowar Elves is pretty big. The next creatures that we should probably talk about are, you know, kind of the different different creatures. So you see here you have 2 Knight of Autumns in the main and a Shalai and 2 Lyras in the main deck. So you have some really powerful white cards that you don't have access to in the green black mid-range decks. Lyra is one of the best cards you can possibly play against the Boros aggro decks, and it does a fine job in most other matchups. Its worst matchup by far is Control. Knight of Autumn is something that, you know, I'm trying it out in the main deck. These used to be Knight of Graces, but I really felt like I wanted more powerful things coming from my Llanowar Elves. The most powerful things you can do with Llanowar Elves is play a 3-drop right after it and be ahead of curve on your opponents. And if you're going to play a 4/3 creature, or you're going to come down and gain 4 life in certain matchups, just depending on what the matchup is, Knight of Autumn can be really good. And it also just has a ton of versatility against other decks that are going to try and beat you with things like Ixalan's Binding or Experimental Frenzy, things like that, just giving you more main deck answers than those Vivien Reids to enchantments. The other creatures that are really important in this deck are going to be those Adanto Vanguards and those Carnage Tyrants. The reason that they're so important is because of On Serra's Wings, but at the same time, just being able to play an Adanto Vanguard and just start attacking early with this deck is something that I really think this deck has that the green-black deck doesn't have, and you want to be able to optimize that. And then depending on the matchup, you'll actually board out all the Adanto Vanguards for some cards we'll talk about in the sideboard. The next thing that we should probably talk about is the Planeswalkers. I think that, you know, having 5 Planeswalkers, 2 Karns, and 3 Vivien Reids is pretty big. I have no idea why Vivien Reid is so good in this format. I actually haven't figured it out yet. It might be the total number of really insane flyers in the format, but basically she's just this card advantage that kills some of the most problematic things in the format. Whether it comes down and kills an Experimental Frenzy, whether it comes down and kills a Crackling Drake, a Niv Mizzet, she just does a lot of work. And then on the other side, Karn has impressed me a lot. He has so much loyalty. He comes down, goes up to 6. He can just keep plussing to give you more and more card advantage going through your deck, minusing when you find something that you want. And then if eventually, it doesn't happen a lot, but sometimes you just get him to such high loyalty, you're just like minus, 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 and then you have a giant army. It takes a long time on the minuses, but sometimes it definitely works for you.
Awesome. Let's go over the removal.
Yeah, there's not a ton of removal in this deck. You kind of use a Sure Assembly a little bit as removal at times, but the main thing you have is the 2 Baffling Ends and the Ixalan's Binding. It's pretty often that you're actually using your History of Benalia as removal to kind of chump block and then chump block again to give you a little bit of card advantage. Outside of that, the deck isn't really trying to play the removal game. It's trying to have the biggest threat on board and control the game that way by making the game about what you want it to be about. So you make it about that Lyra, you make it about that Carnage Tyrant, you make it about your Planeswalker, rather than trying to control the game and then win with something. You try and win with something proactively and change the game plan of your opponent around that. Baffling End is just pretty decent in this format. There's lots of 3 or less cost stuff to kill. How are they going to kill it, right? So if they're going to kill a Baffling End, it's going to be with a Vivien Reid minus or with something like a Thrashing Brontodon. And I'm mostly okay trading my Baffling End for a 3/3 in exchange for their Thrashing Brontodon. So it just slows down some of the aggressive decks. You could be playing something other than Adanto Vanguard or something other than some of the things that you're playing in the slots that you're playing them. You just kind of want the right amount in your curve, and Baffling End kind of just fills the spot well for what you're paying for its mana cost. Ixalan's Binding is here to take out those Vivien Reids and those Veraskas and those Planeswalkers, but at the same time, you know, you'll play against things like Boros Angels a lot on Arena, and if you can binding their binding, they're going to have a really, really hard time coming back in that game because they don't have another way really to deal with your own Lyras or your Planeswalkers. So Ixalan's Binding is actually a great target for Ixalan's Binding, but the others are typically some of the big hitters, you know, other Lyras, things like that.
Do you have any tips and tricks with the deck?
One of the number one things that you need to know when you play a Llanowar Elves deck is how your curve works. So with Llanowar Elves specifically in this deck, if you have a Temple Guardian, you're supposed to pay the life basically 100% of the time, as long as you have a second white source. The reason for this is because turn 2 history is one of the best plays in the entire deck. So it's definitely worth the life. Even if you don't have a history in your hand and you have a second white land, you know, the ability just to draw that on the first turn and then immediately play it is super valuable. The other thing I would say is understand how you want to use things like your Flower Flourishes and your Sure Assemblies. Flower Flourish is one that sometimes you want the land, sometimes you want to build up a board and you want to be able to win in something like a green mid-range mirror, things like that for the assembly side. So it's just kind of important to understand how you want to play your split cards and at what point you are in the game with them. Other things I kind of already talked about, you know, the Karn minus ability. And then the last thing kind of with the main deck is the Shalai. I think that Shalai is a little bit, it's not as good in this deck as some of the other decks you might have played Shalai in, but it is really good in the fact that it stops Settle the Wreckage on your Carnage Tyrants. If you can back up your Carnage Tyrant with a Shalai, it's pretty hard to kill outside of a Wrath effect.
Let's go over the sideboard.
Yeah, so the sideboard we have is 4 Tocatli Honor Guard, 2 Squire's Devotion, 2 Settle the Wreckage, 1 Thrashing Brontodon, a 3rd Baffling End, 1 Ajani, Adversary of Tyrants, 1 Shalai, 2 Vine Mare, and 1 more Lyra. So the sideboard's pretty clean. You just kind of take out the Vanguards for the Tocatli Honor Guards. You bring in the Vine Mares against some of the black decks and games where you want to keep in your Honor Guards and just play as many Boggle effect games as possible. Maybe against certain decks you want to bring in Squire's Devotion to even have a bigger Boggles game. And then you kind of have an assortment of answers, you know, just in the form of the 1 Thrashing Brontodon, the 1 Baffling End, the 1 Shalai is an answer for your opponent's sideboard plans against you. And then the Ajani just is to increase your threat density.
Let's go over key matchups with the deck.
Yeah, I think that you're really favored in quite a few matchups with this deck. This is my favorite standard deck by a significant margin. I think you're favored against black-green. I don't even know how black-green could build to beat you. Maybe if they go like super planeswalker heavy with Vraskas to like hit your bindings and stuff like that, that could be tough for you. But you have so many Carnage Tyrants. You're already maxed out on the Vivien Reids for the most part, and you have Lyras of your own, Karns, things like that, History of Benalia. It's just a really tough matchup for them. Any of the blue-black or Grixis mid-range decks are really good for you. The main reason for that is just Adanto Vanguard, Vine Mare, like Carnage Tyrant. These are all just pretty insane cards in those matchups. Lyra's one that is really bad against control, so your game plan against control can get pretty rough game one, just because all your threats are super easy to deal with outside of Carnage Tyrant and Adanto Vanguard, but that is your game plan against those decks. Against Mono Red, I think that it's pretty close to 50-50. You have a lot of cards for the matchup, though. You know, you have Lyra, you have an extra Thrashing Brontodon and a Baffling End post board. You have Settle the Wreckage, you have Squire's Devotion. So it's certainly something that you can switch on your side post board. And then, you know, I actually haven't played against decks like Mono Blue with this, but I would assume that you're probably not great there. But I think that's such a small percentage of the metagame that that's okay.
How do you beat this deck?
I think Drakes can beat it. So, for example, if I Ixalan's binding an Arclight Phoenix, they can't cast it from their hand, but they can still get them back from the graveyard, so it's not very effective there. Baffling End isn't good in the matchup, so most of my removal is blanked in that matchup. The other thing is that because I'm really good at holding the ground, the fact that all of their creatures are flyers makes it pretty difficult for me, and if they have removal for my Lyra, I'm just going to be in big trouble. The other thing is Entrancing Melody is really good against this deck, so if I put an On Sarah's Wings on a Adanto Vanguard, and they Entrancing Melody, it only costs them 4 mana to steal 2 of my cards. So I think that that's the way to beat this deck, and kind of understanding the matchup and how you want to play it is going to be important from there.
Any final thoughts on green-white midrange?
No, I think this deck is really fun. It's kind of a labor of love for me right now. It's something I've really been enjoying trying and playing, and I'm going to keep doing it. So, you know, if you want a sideboard guide, I'm going to be making one either today or tomorrow. You can go to Constructed Critics on Facebook. If you're a patron of $12 or more at patreon.com/ccmtg, you can get access to that kind of stuff.
Thank you so much to Spencer Howland from Constructed Criticism for another deck guide. Please go check out his content at constructedcriticism.com. He's putting out some of the best competitive content out there right now and deserves your subscription. And if you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe to Snapkeep Arcade for Magic deck guides, lore videos, and arena news. This has been Boots with Snapkeep Arcade. Thanks for watching.